Hi, I'm Rachel Thompson. And last month I watched a woman throw hot coffee across my laptop screen while screaming that I was destroying her marriage. The coffee wasn't even good coffee. It was that overpriced burnt stuff from the hotel lobby that tastes like disappointment and cost $8. But that wasn't the worst part. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worst part was realizing that my business partner of 3 years had been lying to both of us, and I had the bank statements to prove it. I never thought vindication would smell like Colombian dark roast and sound like a hard drive clicking its last breath. But sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it shows up in spreadsheets and wire transfer receipts, demanding you choose between loyalty and reality. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days straight, turning Portland's streets into a network of mirrors that reflected the gray sky back at itself. I was running late to Meridian, the kind of restaurant where they give you 3 different forks and charge $35 for salmon that probably costs them $8. My business partner, David Martinez, had insisted we meet there to celebrate, landing the Cascade Industries account, our biggest client yet, a 6-figure digital marketing contract that would finally put our little agency on the map. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, shaking raindrops from my wool coat. The hostess, a young woman with perfectly straightened hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, glanced at her tablet. Rachel Thompson, party of 3. David had mentioned bringing someone, though he'd been vague about who. I assumed it was Kevin Walsh, our mutual friend who'd connected us with the Cascade opportunity in the first place. The dining room buzzed with the low hum of conversations layered over soft jazz. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from Art Deco fixtures, casting small rainbows across white tablecloths. David was already seated at a corner table, his dark hair still damp from the rain, wearing the navy blazer he saved for important clients. But the woman sitting across from him wasn't Kevin. She was petite with shoulder-length blonde hair, wearing a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Her posture was rigid, and even from across the room, I could see the tension in her shoulders. As I approached the table, David stood up with that easy smile he'd perfected over years of client meetings. Rachel, perfect timing. I'd like you to meet my wife, Linda. Linda, this is Rachel, my business partner I've told you so much about. Linda Martinez turned to face me, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Her green eyes were sharp, calculating, studying my face like she was memorizing evidence. Her handshake was firm, almost aggressive, lasting just a beat too long. "So you're Rachel," she said, her voice pleasant, but with an edge that made my skin prickle. "David talks about you constantly." I slid into my seat, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. "It's wonderful to finally meet you. David's mentioned how supportive you've been of the business." The wine David had ordered was already on the table, a bottle of something expensive that I didn't recognize. He poured me a glass with slightly shaky hands, which was unusual for someone who typically had the steady confidence of a surgeon. Linda's smile was perfectly pleasant and completely hollow. "Oh yes, I've been very interested in the business lately, especially the travel arrangements and late-night meetings." She picked up her wine glass and took a sip, never breaking eye contact with me. "David tells me you two spend quite a bit of time together." The server appeared at our table, a young man with enthusiastic energy who clearly hadn't read the room. "Good evening, folks. Can I start you with some appetizers tonight? We have a fantastic burrata with honey-drizzled figs, or perhaps the seared scallops with cauliflower puree." David ordered quickly, his voice tighter than usual. "We'll take the burrata and the scallops, and another bottle of this wine." The server nodded and disappeared, leaving us in a silence that felt heavy with unspoken accusations. I decided to fill the quiet with work talk, hoping to steer the conversation toward safer ground. "The Cascade contract is going to be transformative for us. 6 months of intensive social media management, Plus, they're interested in expanding into influencer partnerships. It's exactly the kind of client we've been working toward. Linda set down her wine glass with a soft clink. How lovely. And I suppose this will require even more travel together? More late dinners and weekend strategy sessions? Her tone was conversational, but there was steel underneath it. David cleared his throat. Linda, we've discussed this. Rachel and I are business partners. Everything we do is professional. But even as he said it, he couldn't quite meet my eyes, and I felt the first stirring of real unease. Of course it is, Linda replied smoothly. Just like that conference in Seattle last month was purely professional. And the client dinner in San Francisco. And all those evenings you've been working late at the office. She turned back to me. Rachel, you seem like a smart woman. Tell me, in your professional opinion, is it normal for business partners to text each other at 11 o'clock at night? My mouth went dry. I had texted David late occasionally, usually about urgent client issues or deadlines. But the way Linda said it made those innocent messages sound like something else entirely. I could feel heat rising in my cheeks. Any communication David and I have is strictly about work. We have deadlines to meet and clients to serve. The appetizers arrived, giving us a brief reprieve from the tension. The burrata looked beautiful, creamy white cheese surrounded by perfectly arranged figs and microgreens. But my appetite had vanished completely. I picked up my fork anyway, trying to appear normal while my mind raced through every interaction David and I had shared over the past 3 years. Linda delicately cut a piece of the burrata, her movements precise and controlled. I've been married to David for 8 years, Rachel. I know when something has changed. She placed the cheese in her mouth and chewed thoughtfully. He comes home distracted, takes phone calls in the other room, and spends more time at the office than he does with his own family. David's face had gone pale. Linda, please. This isn't the place for this conversation. But she continued as if he hadn't spoken. Last week I found a credit card statement with charges I didn't recognize. Expensive dinners, hotel rooms, flowers from a florist I've never heard of. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Would you like to see it, Rachel? Because I think you might find it enlightening. My hands were trembling, slightly as I set down my fork. I don't know what you think is happening, but I can assure you that David and I have never been anything other than business partners and friends. Every dinner we've shared has been with clients or related to work. Linda unfolded the paper and slid it across the table toward me. The credit card statement was covered in yellow highlighter marks. Meridian Restaurant, $87. The Heathman Hotel, $163. Blossom's Flower Shop, $45. Portland City Grill, $100. And $12. The dates went back over the past 2 months, a pattern of expensive charges that would certainly look suspicious to a worried wife. But as I studied the statement more carefully, something didn't add up. The Heathman Hotel charge was from a Tuesday night when I knew David had been in town, not traveling. We'd had a video conference call with a client that evening, and he'd been at home. I remembered because his cat had walked across his keyboard in the middle of the presentation. And the Portland City Grill charge was from a Saturday when David had supposedly been visiting his mother in Eugene. I looked up at David, who was staring at his plate like it might provide answers. These charges? I said slowly. Some of these dates don't make sense. David, weren't you home on the 15th? We had that call with the brewery client. Linda's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Of course he wasn't home. He told me he was working late with you. A horrible realization was beginning to form in my mind. I pulled out my phone and opened my calendar app, scrolling back through the dates on the statement. David, I said quietly, on March 22nd, when this Portland City Grill charge happened, where did you tell Linda you were? David's face had gone from pale to gray. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make 1,000 times when he was stressed about a client presentation. I told her I was having a work dinner with you. But we weren't, I said, my voice getting stronger. I was at my cousin's wedding that night. I have pictures on my Instagram. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You can check. I turned to Linda, who was looking between us with confusion replacing some of her anger. Linda, I think there might be another explanation for these charges. What do you mean? She asked, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. I mean that if David told you he was with me on these dates, but I can prove I was somewhere else, then he was lying to both of us. I started pulling up photos and calendar entries on my phone. March 15th, I was at a networking event downtown. March 22nd, my cousin's wedding in Bend. April 3rd, I was sick with the flu and posted about it on social media. Linda snatched my phone and scrolled through the evidence, her face growing paler with each photo and post. She looked at David with an expression I'd never want to see directed at me. David. Who were you with? The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. David's hands were shaking as he reached for his wine glass. Linda, I can explain. Then explain, she said, her voice deadly quiet. Explain why you've been lying to me for months. Explain why you've been using our business partner as your alibi. Explain why I've been harassing an innocent woman because you're too much of a coward to tell the truth. I felt sick to my stomach, not just from the wine I'd barely touched, but from the realization that I'd been an unwitting accomplice in David's deception. Every time he'd mentioned working late, every client dinner he'd claimed we'd attended together, every business trip that I'd thought was just poor communication on his part, it had all been lies designed to cover up whatever he was really doing. David finally looked up from his plate, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. There's someone else, he whispered. It started a few months ago. I never meant for it to go this far. Linda's wine glass hit the table with enough force to splash red wine across the white tablecloth. The sound made several nearby diners turn to look at our table. You never meant for it to go this far? She hissed. You never meant to get caught, you mean. She turned to me, and I braced myself for another accusation, but her expression had changed completely. Rachel, I owe you a massive apology. I've been watching you, following you, convinced that you were destroying my marriage. I even hired a private investigator to photograph you and David together. My stomach dropped even further. You had me followed? She nodded miserably. I have pictures of every time you left the office building, every restaurant you went to alone, every coffee shop where you worked by yourself. I was building a case against you in my head, convinced that you were the other woman. But you weren't having secret meetings with my husband because you didn't even know about the secret meetings. The server returned to check on our appetizers, which sat largely untouched on our plates. Is everything all right here? He asked, clearly sensing the tension. We're fine, David said quickly, but his voice cracked on the words. Could we get the check, please? As the server hurried away, Linda gathered her purse and coat. I'm leaving, she announced. David, don't come home tonight. Or tomorrow. We'll talk when I've decided whether this marriage is worth saving. She stood up and looked at me one last time. Rachel, I hope you'll accept my apology. And I hope you'll be very careful about who you trust with your business. She walked away without looking back, leaving David and me sitting in the wreckage of his lies. The silence between us was different now, heavier with the weight of broken trust and ruined partnerships. David finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to get caught up in this. But I was caught up in it, I replied, my own voice shaking with anger that was just beginning to surface. For months, you've been using me as your alibi. You've put my reputation at risk, destroyed your marriage, and made me an accessory to your affair without my knowledge or consent." He reached across the table like he might try to take my hand, but I pulled back. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The business, our partnership, it means everything to me." "Then why did you risk it?" I asked. "Why did you risk everything we've built together for someone whose name I don't even know?" David stared at the wine-stained tablecloth for a long moment. "Her name is Stephanie. She's a client relations manager at Cascade Industries. It started during the contract negotiations." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "You're having an affair with someone from our biggest client? Our most important contract? Do you understand what this could do to our business if it comes out?" The server returned with our check, setting it on the table with obvious relief that his part in this drama was ending. David pulled out his credit card without looking at the total. "I'll take care of it," he said. "No," I replied, pulling out my own card. "I'll pay for my own meal. I'm not going to be connected to any more of your financial transactions than I already am." As we waited for the credit card machine, I tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. In the span of an hour, I'd discovered that my business partner was a liar. I'd been unknowingly providing alibis for his affair, and our biggest client relationship was built on a foundation that could crumble at any moment. David signed his receipt with a shaky hand. "Rachel, we need to talk about the business, about how we move forward from this." I shook my head. "Tonight isn't the night for that conversation. I need time to think about what this means. For the business, for our partnership, for everything." I gathered my coat and purse, my hands steadier now that the initial shock was wearing off. David remained seated as I stood up, looking smaller somehow in his expensive blazer. "David," I said, pausing beside the table, "whatever happens next, you need to understand that I will not let your personal choices destroy what we've built. I've worked too hard for too long to watch it all disappear because you couldn't keep your personal life separate from business." He nodded without meeting my eyes. "I know. I'll find a way to fix this." As I walked toward the restaurant's exit, I could feel the stares of other diners who had witnessed at least part of the drama. The rain had intensified while we were inside, and I stood under the restaurant's awning for a moment, watching the water cascade off the building's modern architecture. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It was Linda. "Rachel, this is Linda Martinez. I got your number from David's phone. Could we meet tomorrow? I think there are things you should know about your business that David hasn't told you." I stared at the message for a long time, rain drumming against the awning above me. The evening had already revealed more betrayal than I'd expected to handle, but Linda's words suggested that David's lies might extend beyond his personal life into our professional partnership. I typed back a simple response. "Yes. Let's meet." As I walked to my car through the Portland rain, I realized that discovering the truth about David's affair might have been the easy part. The real challenge would be uncovering what other secrets he'd been keeping and whether our business partnership could survive the revelations that were clearly still to come. The drive back to my apartment in Hawthorne gave me time to think, though the thoughts weren't particularly comforting. Every red light in turn gave me another moment to remember a conversation, a late-night text, or a canceled meeting that suddenly seemed suspicious in this new context. How many times had David mentioned working late when he was actually with Stephanie? How many business trips had he claimed that never happened? And most importantly, what did Linda think I needed to know about our business that David had kept hidden? By the time I pulled into my parking spot behind the vintage apartment building I called home, the rain had finally begun to slow. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of traffic on Hawthorne Boulevard. The evening had started with celebration and ended with the destruction of both a marriage and, quite possibly, a business partnership. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, but tonight I just needed to process what I'd already learned. As I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda's text message was going to change everything again. And I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever truth she was planning to share. I woke up the next morning to the sound of construction work from the apartment complex across the street. The rhythmic hammering felt like it was happening inside my skull, though I knew that was just the residual stress from the previous evening. My coffee maker gurgled to life as I stood at my kitchen window, watching workers in hard hats navigate around scaffolding in the gray morning light. Portland's persistent drizzle had returned, painting everything in muted watercolors. Linda's text message from the night before sat heavy in my mind. I'd barely slept, turning over possibilities of what business secrets she might reveal. Every scenario I imagined made my stomach clench tighter. Had David been embezzling money? Were there client relationships I didn't know about? Had he been making deals behind my back that could jeopardize everything we'd built? My phone buzzed at exactly 8 o'clock. Coffee shop on Alberta, Courier Coffee, 9:30, come alone. Linda's messages were as direct as her personality. The drive across town gave me time to rehearse conversations in my head, though I suspected none of my preparation would matter once Linda started talking. Alberta Street was already busy with morning commuters and dog walkers despite the weather. Courier Coffee occupied a corner building that had probably been a gas station decades ago, its large windows now fogged with steam from espresso machines and the breath of customers escaping the cold. I spotted Linda immediately. She sat at a small table near the back, her blonde hair pulled into a severe ponytail, wearing jeans and a gray sweater that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had at the restaurant. 2 large coffee cups sat on the table between her hands, which were wrapped around a third cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. I slid into the seat across from her, accepting the coffee she pushed toward me. The first sip was bitter and strong, exactly what I needed. Linda looked like she hadn't slept either. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect makeup was minimal. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice hoarse. "I know last night was horrible for both of us, but there are things you need to know about your business. Things David has been hiding from you." She reached into a leather messenger bag and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. "I've been suspicious about David's behavior for months, but I thought it was about another woman. So I started investigating. I hired a private investigator, yes, but I also started going through our financial records, our joint accounts, anything I could access legally as his wife." My coffee suddenly tasted like ash. "What did you find?" Linda opened the folder and spread several documents across the small table. Bank statements, credit card bills, and what looked like business contracts written in dense legal language. What I found was that David has been living a double life in more ways than one. The affair with Stephanie is just the tip of the iceberg. She pointed to a bank statement highlighted in yellow. "This is David's personal checking account. Look at these deposits. $15,000 in January, $22,000 in March, $35,000 2 weeks ago. These aren't salary payments from your business, Rachel. Your company doesn't have this kind of cash flow." I studied the numbers, my hands starting to shake. "You're right. Our biggest month ever was $12,000 in profit, and that was split between both of us." "Where is this money coming from?" Linda flipped to another document. "I found this contract hidden in David's home office. It's an exclusive digital marketing agreement with a company called Northwest Ventures, signed 3 months ago, for $200,000 over 6 months. The blood drained from my face. I'd never heard of Northwest Ventures. I grabbed the contract and scanned the signature line. David Martinez, managing partner, Martinez Thompson, Digital Solutions. But the business license and tax information listed only David's name and address. My name appeared nowhere on the document. Linda watched my expression carefully. "You didn't know about this contract, did you?" I shook my head, unable to speak. Our business was supposed to be 50-50 partners. Every major decision was supposed to be made together. Every client contract required both signatures, but this document made it look like David was the sole owner of our company. "There's more," Linda continued. She pulled out another set of papers. David opened a separate business bank account in January. All the payments from this Northwest Ventures contract have been going into that account. An account you're not authorized to access. I felt sick. 3 years of working 18-hour days, pitching clients, building websites, managing social media campaigns, and David had been secretly operating a parallel business using our company's reputation and resources. "How much money are we talking about?" Linda pointed to the most recent bank statement. "As of last week, there's over $90,000 in that account. Money that should have been split between both of you if you're truly equal partners." The coffee shop around us continued its morning routine. Students typed on laptops, construction workers grabbed breakfast sandwiches, and couples shared quiet conversations over their morning caffeine. But I felt like I was sitting in a bubble of betrayal that separated me from the normal world. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "David is your husband. Why help me?" Linda's laugh was bitter. "Because David has been stealing from both of us. He's been using money that should have gone toward our mortgage, our savings, our future, to fund his affair and his secret business dealings." She leaned forward, her green eyes intense. "And because I think Stephanie might not be just his partner, I think she might be his business partner too." My stomach dropped even further. "What do you mean?" Linda pulled out her phone and showed me a series of photos. "The private investigator I hired took these last week. David and Stephanie at lunch, but look at what's on the table between them." I squinted at the phone screen. Laptops, documents, and what looked like presentation materials. They weren't holding hands or gazing romantically at each other. They were working. "These look like business meetings," I said slowly. "Exactly. And when I cross-referenced the dates of these meetings with the dates David told me he was working late with you, they match perfectly. He's been using you as his alibi to meet with Stephanie about business deals you know nothing about." The full scope of David's deception was starting to become clear. He hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been systematically building a separate business empire while using our partnership as a front. Every late night I'd assumed he was working. On our shared projects, he'd actually been developing contracts that would benefit only him. Linda reached across the table and touched my hand. "Rachel, I think David has been planning to leave your partnership for months. I think he's been positioning himself to take the best clients and the most profitable contracts with him when he goes." I pulled my hand back and gripped my coffee cup tighter. The Cascade Industries contract. That was supposed to be our breakthrough client, the 6-figure deal that would establish our agency as a serious player in the Portland market. Linda nodded grimly. "I think that was always meant to be David's exit strategy. Build a relationship with Cascade through your partnership, then take the contract with him to his new business with Stephanie." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. David's insistence on handling most of the Cascade communications personally. His vague responses when I asked about contract details. His sudden interest in keeping better financial records separate from our usual shared systems. "Do you have proof of this?" I asked. Linda slid another document across the table. "This is a business license application for Martinez Digital Consulting, filed 2 weeks ago. The business address is Stephanie's apartment." I stared at the application, seeing my professional future crumbling before my eyes. David wasn't just cheating on his wife. He was preparing to steal our entire business, leaving me with nothing but the debts and overhead while he walked away with the profitable contracts. "What are you going to do?" Linda asked. "I don't know. I'm not even sure what legal rights I have." Our partnership agreement was pretty informal. Most of our business relationships were built on David's connections and my creative work. But proving ownership of those relationships might be complicated. Linda leaned back in her chair. "I've been thinking about that. David might have the social connections, but you have something he can't replicate. You have the creative portfolio. Every campaign, every design, every piece of content that built your company's reputation. Do you have documentation of your work? I nodded slowly. I keep detailed records of every project, design files, content calendars, campaign analytics, client feedback. Everything is backed up on cloud storage that only I have access to. Good, because I think David's new business venture might not be as solid as he thinks it is. Stephanie works for Cascade Industries, but she's not in a position to make contracting decisions. She's client relations, not executive level. If David is planning to take the Cascade contract with him, he might be overestimating his influence. A spark of hope flickered in my chest. You think the contract might not be as secure as he believes? Linda smiled for the first time since I'd met her. I think David has been lying to everyone for so long that he might have started believing his own lies. Stephanie might not have the authority he thinks she has. The Cascade executives might not even know about their personal relationship. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the implications. The morning rush was starting to thin out as people headed to their offices and schools. I watched a woman at the counter order a complicated drink, gesticulating enthusiastically, to the barista about foam consistency and syrup ratios. Her biggest concern was getting her latte perfect. I envied her. Linda broke the silence. Rachel, I have a proposition for you. I looked at her warily. What kind of proposition? I want to help you save your business. David has betrayed both of us, and I want him to face consequences for what he's done. But more than that, I want to make sure you don't lose everything you've worked for because of his selfishness. She pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. This is my lawyer, Margaret Chen. She specializes in business partnership disputes and fraud cases. I've already told her about the situation and she's willing to take your case. I picked up the card, feeling its expensive weight between my fingers. Why would you do this for me? We barely know each other. Because David made us enemies when we should have been allies. He pitted us against each other to cover his own tracks. And because I've spent 8 years married to a man who thought he could manipulate everyone around him without consequences. She stood up and gathered her papers. It's time someone called him on it. Linda left me sitting at the coffee shop with a folder full of evidence and a business card that might represent my only chance at salvaging my professional life. I stayed for another hour, reading through every document she'd given me, trying to understand the full scope of David's deception. The drive to Margaret Chen's law office took me through downtown Portland, past the building where David and I had started our business 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was driving past our professional beginning while potentially heading toward its legal ending. Margaret Chen's office occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower overlooking the Willamette River. The waiting room was decorated in muted grays and blues, with abstract art that probably cost more than most people's cars. Margaret herself was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled into an elegant bun, and the kind of confidence that came from decades of winning difficult cases. She reviewed Linda's documentation with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. Her questions were precise and comprehensive. How was your partnership originally structured? What written agreements exist? Who has access to business accounts? What proof do you have of your creative contributions? After an hour of discussion, Margaret leaned back in her leather chair and delivered her assessment. You have a strong case for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. David has clearly violated the terms of your partnership by creating competing business interests without your knowledge. The secret contracts and hidden bank accounts demonstrate a pattern of deception that courts take very seriously. But what can I actually recover? I asked. Even if we prove he cheated me, the money is already gone, and the client relationships might be damaged beyond repair. Margaret smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. That's where things get interesting. If David has been using company resources to develop his side business, you're entitled to damages beyond just your share of the hidden profits. Client lists, creative work, business reputation, even the value of time you spent unknowingly supporting his competing enterprise. She pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. More importantly, if David's relationship with Stephanie violates Cascade Industries' ethics policies, we might be able to use that as leverage. Most major companies have strict rules about employee relationships with vendor partners. A plan was starting to form in my mind. What if we could prove that David's entire relationship with Cascade was built on an inappropriate personal relationship rather than professional merit? Margaret nodded approvingly. Exactly. If Cascade discovers that their employee has been personally involved with a vendor without proper disclosure, they might terminate the contract entirely. That would leave David's new business without its foundation client. I left Margaret's office with a retainer agreement and a strategy that felt like my first real chance at fighting back. The afternoon had turned sunny, one of those rare Portland days when the city looked like the tourism brochures promised. I walked along the waterfront, watching joggers and cyclists navigate the path between the river and downtown. My phone rang as I reached the Burnside Bridge. David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But avoidance wouldn't solve anything. Rachel? Thank God you answered. We need to talk about yesterday. About how we move forward with the business. His voice sounded strained, like he'd been practicing this conversation. I kept walking, using the rhythm of my steps to stay calm. I think we're past the point of simple conversations, David. I think we need to involve lawyers. There was a long pause. What do you mean, lawyers? Rachel, I know yesterday was complicated, but we can work through this. We've built something good together. The audacity of his statement stopped me in my tracks. I stood at the edge of the bridge, looking down at the dark water flowing beneath the city. David, I know about Northwest Ventures. I know about the secret bank account. I know about the business license you filed with Stephanie. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Smaller. How do you know about that? Your wife hired a private investigator. She's been tracking your movements for months, and she found financial records you thought you'd hidden. She shared everything with me this morning. Rachel, I can explain. It's not what you think. I laughed, surprising myself with how bitter it sounded. It's exactly what I think, David. You've been stealing from our partnership to fund a competing business. You've been using me as an alibi for meetings with your new business partner, who also happens to be your affair partner. You've been planning to take our biggest client with you when you abandon our partnership. David's breathing was audible through the phone. I never meant for it to happen this way. But it did happen this way. And now, there are going to be consequences. I recommend you get a lawyer, because mine is very good at partnership fraud cases. I hung up before he could respond. The phone immediately started ringing again, but I turned it off and dropped it into my purse. The walk back to my car gave me time to think about next steps. Margaret had outlined a legal strategy that could potentially recover my financial losses and protect the business I'd spent 3 years building. But beyond the legal issues, I needed to think about practical damage control. Which clients might be at risk? What projects needed immediate attention? How could I maintain business operations while fighting a legal battle? By the time I reached my car, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to let David's betrayal destroy everything I'd worked for. I was going to fight for every client, every contract, and every dollar he'd tried to steal. And I was going to make sure that Stephanie and Cascade Industries knew exactly what kind of business relationship they'd been unknowingly supporting. The drive home took me past our office building on Morrison Street. I could see lights on in our third-floor windows, which meant David was probably there, frantically trying to figure out damage control strategies. Part of me wanted to go upstairs and confront him directly, but Margaret had advised against any contact that wasn't documented and supervised. Instead, I drove home and spent the evening preparing for war. I backed up every file, documented every client relationship, and compiled a comprehensive portfolio of my creative work. If David wanted to try to claim credit for our business success, he was going to discover that I had evidence of every campaign, every design, and every strategy that had built our reputation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. David had spent so much energy on deception that he'd forgotten the most important rule of business partnerships. The person who does the actual work always has the real power. And I'd been doing the real work all along. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night spent making difficult decisions. I'd spent hours organizing evidence, backing up files, and preparing for what Margaret Chen had called the documentation phase of our legal strategy. My dining table looked like a war room, covered with printed emails, financial records, and client portfolios arranged in chronological order. At 7:30, I received an unexpected call from Kevin Walsh, the mutual friend who had connected us with the Cascade Industries opportunity. His voice carried an urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Rachel, I need to see you this morning. Something's happened with the Cascade contract that you need to know about. Can we meet at Powell's? Books in an hour?" Powell's was neutral territory, a sprawling bookstore where business conversations could blend into the background noise of literary browsing. I found Kevin in the business section, nervously flipping through a book on corporate ethics. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened and his hair showing signs of repeated finger combing. Kevin had always been the steady one in our professional circle, the kind of person who returned phone calls promptly and never made promises he couldn't keep. Seeing him agitated made my stomach clench with anticipation of more bad news. We found a quiet corner near the management theory shelves, where Kevin pulled out his phone and showed me an email chain that made my blood run cold. The messages were between David and Stephanie, forwarded to Kevin by someone at Cascade whose name I didn't recognize. "Rachel," Kevin said quietly, "David contacted Cascade Industries yesterday afternoon. He told them that your partnership was dissolving and that he would be taking over all services under a new company structure. He requested that all future communications and payments be directed to Martinez Digital Consulting." I grabbed Kevin's phone and scrolled through the email thread. David's message to Cascade was professionally worded, but devastating in its implications. He claimed that I was leaving the business to pursue other opportunities and that he would ensure seamless continuity of services. He'd even included a proposed contract amendment that would transfer all remaining payments to his new company. "But here's the thing," Kevin continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Stephanie never disclosed her personal relationship with David to her supervisors. When the contract transfer request arrived, it went through standard approval channels. Someone in Cascade's legal department flagged it for review because it seemed unusual for a vendor to completely restructure mid-contract. Kevin showed me another email, this one from Cascade's legal counsel to their internal team. The lawyer had discovered that Stephanie had been the primary contact for our original contract negotiations and was now involved in approving a transfer to a company owned by someone she'd been meeting with regularly outside of official business hours. My hands started shaking as I read the legal department's conclusions. They'd characterized the situation as a potential conflict of interest that could expose the company to vendor relationship violations. The email recommended suspending all contract activities pending a full ethics review. "What does this mean for the contract?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Kevin's expression was grim. "As of this morning, Cascade has frozen all payments and suspended the marketing campaign. They're conducting an internal investigation into Stephanie's role in the vendor selection process and David's relationship with her. The entire contract is under review." I felt like I was watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. The Cascade contract wasn't just our biggest client. It represented nearly 60% of our projected revenue for the year. Without it, both my business and David's new venture would be financially crippled. "There's more," Kevin said reluctantly. Stephanie has been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, and David's request for contract transfer has been formally denied. Cascade won't work with Martinez Digital Consulting because of the ethics violations. A mixture of relief and terror washed over me. David's betrayal had backfired spectacularly, but the collateral damage was destroying the business I'd worked 3 years to build. We were both going down with the ship he'd deliberately sabotaged. Kevin reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card. Rachel, there might be a way to salvage this. The person who forwarded me these emails is Marcus Rivera, Cascade's director of marketing. He's the one who originally approved our contract, and he's not happy about how this situation developed. I studied the business card, noting the corporate address in one of Portland's newest office towers. What does he want? Kevin hesitated. He wants to meet with you directly, without David. Marcus feels that the company was misled about the vendor relationship structure, and he's interested in exploring whether services could continue with just your portion of the partnership. The possibility hit me like a lifeline, thrown to a drowning person. If I could convince Cascade to work directly with me, I might be able to save not just the contract, but also establish my independence from David's web of deception. When does he want to meet? Today, 2 o'clock at their offices. Kevin handed me a folder. I took the liberty of pulling together some information that might help. Your individual portfolio, the creative work you've done on their account, and documentation of your role in the original project proposals. I spent the rest of the morning preparing for what felt like the most important business meeting of my life. Margaret Chen reviewed the Cascade situation and advised me on legal boundaries for the conversation. I couldn't make claims about David's conduct that might interfere with their internal investigation, but I could present factual information about my own qualifications and contributions. The drive to Cascade Industries headquarters took me through Portland's South Waterfront District, where glass towers reflected the afternoon sun off the Willamette River. The building's lobby was an exercise in corporate modernism, all polished, marble and suspended metal sculptures that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Marcus Rivera met me in the lobby personally, which I took as either a very good sign or evidence that he wanted to deliver bad news face to face. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of successful deal-making. We rode the elevator to the 23rd floor in relative silence, though Marcus made polite conversation about Portland's unpredictable weather and the challenges of finding good coffee in a city famous for its coffee culture. His corner office offered a panoramic view of the city, with Mount Hood visible in the distance on the rare, clear day. Marcus gestured to a conference table where someone had already laid out printed materials. Rachel, thank you for coming on short notice. I'll be direct with you because I think this situation requires honesty from all parties. I appreciated his straightforward approach. It felt refreshing after months of David's evasiveness and misdirection. Our legal department has uncovered some concerning irregularities in how our marketing contract was negotiated and managed, Marcus continued. It appears that our employee Stephanie Blackwood failed to disclose a personal relationship with your business partner that may have influenced vendor selection decisions. He pulled out a timeline that someone had clearly spent considerable time preparing. Based on our investigation, Stephanie and David Martinez began their personal relationship approximately 1 month before your company submitted its proposal for our marketing contract. All subsequent contract negotiations were handled primarily by Stephanie, with minimal oversight from other departments. The timeline made David's deception look even more calculated than I'd realized. He hadn't just stumbled into an affair that compromised our business relationships. He'd cultivated a personal relationship specifically to gain an advantage in contract negotiations. Marcus continued, flipping to another document. What's particularly troubling is that your original proposal included creative work and strategic planning that appears to have been developed primarily by you, but all contract communications have been managed by Mr. Martinez. We're concerned that we may not have been dealing with the actual architect of the services we contracted for. I felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger. For months, David had positioned himself as the primary contact with Cascade, while I did the actual work of developing their campaigns and managing their social media presence. He'd been taking credit for my creative output while building a personal relationship that violated professional ethics standards. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. Rachel, I'm going to ask you some direct questions, and I need completely honest answers. Were you aware of the personal relationship between David Martinez and Stephanie Blackwood? No, I answered immediately. I learned about it 2 days ago when David's wife confronted me about it. She initially thought I was the person David was having an affair with. Were you involved in developing the creative strategy and campaign materials that your company has been providing to Cascade Industries? I opened my portfolio and spread several documents across the conference table. Every piece of creative work, every campaign strategy, and every content calendar has been developed by me. I have original design files, dated versions showing development, progression, and email records of client feedback that I responded to directly. Marcus examined the materials with the attention of someone who understood creative processes. The campaign concepts, visual designs, and strategic frameworks were clearly consistent with a single creative vision rather than collaborative development. One final question, Marcus said. If Cascade Industries were to continue our marketing relationship with a restructured vendor arrangement, would you be able to maintain the same quality and consistency of services independently? I had prepared for this question, but hearing it asked directly still sent adrenaline coursing through my system. Yes. I've been managing the day-to-day execution of your account from the beginning. The transition would actually improve communication, efficiency, because you'd be working directly with the person creating the content rather than through an intermediary. Marcus gathered the materials and stood up from the conference table. Rachel, I'm going to be frank with you. Cascade Industries has zero tolerance for vendor relationships that involve undisclosed conflicts of interest. We cannot and will not continue working with Martinez Thompson Digital Solutions as currently structured. My heart sank, but Marcus wasn't finished. However, we're impressed with the quality of work you've produced, and we believe our marketing goals are best served by maintaining continuity with the creative professional who developed our current campaigns. We'd like to offer you a direct contract to continue providing marketing services as an independent consultant. The relief was so intense I almost laughed out loud. Instead, I managed to maintain professional composure while my internal voice shouted with triumph. Marcus outlined the terms of the proposed arrangement. The contract value would be slightly reduced to reflect the elimination of partnership overhead, but it would still represent substantial revenue for a solo practitioner. More importantly, it would establish me as an independent business owner rather than someone whose professional fate was tied to David's poor decisions. We shook hands on the preliminary agreement, with final contract details to be worked out between our respective legal teams. As I walked back through the corporate lobby, I felt like I was leaving a different person than the one who had entered 2 hours earlier. The drive back across town gave me time to process the magnitude of what had just happened. In the span of a week, I'd discovered that my business partner was a fraud, learned that my biggest client contract was in jeopardy, and somehow managed to emerge with an independent business opportunity that could sustain my professional future. But the real test would come when David learned about Cascade's decision. I knew he wouldn't accept the loss of his primary revenue source without a fight, and his pattern of deception suggested he might try increasingly desperate measures to salvage his situation. I called Margaret Chen from my car to update her on the Cascade meeting. Her response was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. Rachel, this is better than we could have strategically planned. David's attempt to steal the client has backfired so completely that you've ended up with independent control of the relationship. His own unethical behavior has eliminated his ability to compete with you for this business. Margaret also had news about our legal strategy. David's lawyer had contacted her office requesting a meeting to discuss settlement options. Apparently, the prospect of fighting a fraud case while losing his primary revenue source had convinced David that negotiation might be preferable to litigation. I drove home through the late afternoon traffic, mentally calculating the financial implications of the Cascade contract and planning the steps necessary to establish my independent consulting business. The apartment that had felt like a refuge during the past few stressful days now felt like the headquarters of a legitimate professional enterprise. That evening, I sat at my dining table with a laptop and a legal pad, designing the structure of my new business. Thompson Digital Consulting would focus on authentic, relationship-based marketing for mid-sized companies that valued creative consistency over flashy networking. The Cascade contract would provide financial stability, while I built a client base that appreciated working directly with the person creating their content. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Stephanie Blackwood. I think we should talk." I stared at the message for several minutes, weighing the risks and benefits of engaging with the woman whose relationship with David had triggered this entire crisis. Margaret had advised against contact with any parties involved in the Cascade investigation, but Stephanie's message suggested she might have information that could be valuable. I typed back a careful response. "I'm willing to listen, but any conversation would need to be with legal counsel present." Her reply came quickly. "I understand. There are things about David that you need to know, things that go beyond what happened with Cascade." The implication that David's deception extended even further than I'd discovered sent a chill through me. How many other secrets might still be waiting to surface? How many other business relationships might be built on lies I hadn't uncovered yet? I forwarded Stephanie's messages to Margaret Chen and spent the rest of the evening preparing for whatever revelations tomorrow might bring. The legal battle with David was far from over, but for the first time since this crisis began, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength rather than simply trying to survive his betrayals. The transformation from victim to victor was happening gradually, one strategic decision at a time. David had assumed that his social connections and manipulative charm would always give him the upper hand in business relationships. But he'd underestimated the power of authentic professional relationships built on competence rather than deception. As I prepared for bed, I realized that losing David as a business partner might ultimately be the best thing that could have happened to my career. His betrayal had forced me to prove my independent capabilities and establish direct relationships with clients who valued my work. The crisis he'd created had become the catalyst for my professional independence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in my own professional judgment. David's house of lies was collapsing around him, but I was building something honest and sustainable from the wreckage of our failed partnership. The meeting with Stephanie Blackwood took place 3 days later in Margaret Chen's law office, a neutral environment where conversations could be recorded and documented for potential legal proceedings. Stephanie arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a conservative black suit that made her look like she was attending a funeral rather than a business meeting. Her usually polished appearance showed signs of stress, dark circles under her eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she signed the confidentiality agreement Margaret had prepared. Margaret began the meeting with a formal statement outlining the legal boundaries of our conversation. Anything discussed would be privileged communication, but Stephanie had agreed to waive certain protections in exchange for immunity from potential civil litigation related to the Cascade Industries situation. Stephanie looked directly at me for the first time since entering the conference room. "Rachel, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened with David. I've been complicit in something much worse than an affair, and you deserve to know the truth before it destroys more people." She opened a laptop and pulled up a series of files that immediately caught Margaret's attention. Financial spreadsheets, email chains, and what appeared to be contract documents for companies I'd never heard of. "David didn't just lie to you, About our relationship, Stephanie continued. He's been using your business credentials and reputation to secure contracts with multiple companies over the past 18 months. Companies that think they're hiring Martinez Thompson Digital Solutions, but are actually paying into accounts that only David controls. My stomach dropped as she showed us a list of clients I didn't recognize. Bridgeport Manufacturing, Summit Retail Group, Pacific Northwest Logistics, Clearwater Consulting. All companies with professional websites and social media presence that bore the hallmarks of my creative style, but contracts I'd never seen or agreed to. Margaret leaned forward, her expression sharpening with the focus of a prosecutor scenting blood. How many companies are we talking about? And what's the total contract value? Stephanie scrolled through her files. 14 companies over 18 months. Total contract value approaching $800,000. All payments directed to business accounts that Rachel has never had access to. The room felt like it was spinning around me. David hadn't just been cheating on his wife and planning to leave our partnership. He'd been operating an entire shadow business using my work and reputation while I unknowingly provided him with an alibi and legitimate business front. But that's not the worst part, Stephanie said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. David has been subcontracting the actual work to freelancers overseas, delivering substandard services while charging premium rates. Several of these companies have already threatened legal action because their campaigns have failed to meet promised results. Margaret was taking detailed notes, her pen moving rapidly across her legal pad. Stephanie, how did you become involved in this scheme? Stephanie's composure finally cracked, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. David approached me about 6 months ago with what he called a business opportunity. He said Rachel was planning to leave the partnership and that he needed help transitioning client relationships to a new structure. He convinced me that helping him would position me for a lucrative consulting role after I left Cascade. The manipulation was becoming clearer. David had lied to Stephanie just as systematically as he'd lied to me, using our supposed partnership dissolution as justification for his increasingly elaborate deception. I provided David with information about companies that Cascade was considering for vendor partnerships, Stephanie continued. He used that inside information to approach those companies directly, claiming that Martinez Thompson Digital Solutions had been recommended by Cascade's marketing department. Margaret's pen stopped moving. That's wire fraud and potentially racketeering. Using false corporate endorsements to secure contracts crosses federal crime boundaries. The weight of David's crimes was becoming staggering. What had started as a personal betrayal was revealing itself as a complex criminal enterprise that had used both Stephanie and me as unwitting accomplices. Stephanie pulled out her phone and showed us a series of text messages from David. Your messages revealed a man growing increasingly desperate as his various schemes began to unravel. He'd been pressuring Stephanie to help him access Cascade's vendor database, promising her a partnership in his new business if she could provide confidential client information. Last week, he asked me to help him forge documentation that would make it look like you had agreed to transfer your portion of the business to him, Stephanie said. He wanted me to create fake emails and contract amendments that would support his claim that the partnership dissolution was mutual. I felt sick to my stomach. David's betrayal had reached levels of criminality that I hadn't imagined possible. He wasn't just stealing money. He was attempting to frame me as a willing participant in his fraud. Margaret closed her notepad and looked directly at Stephanie. Are you prepared to testify about these activities in both civil and criminal proceedings? Stephanie nodded without hesitation. I've already contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division. They're opening an investigation into David's business practices, and I've agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for prosecutorial immunity. The revelation that federal law enforcement was now involved sent a chill through me. What had started as a partnership dispute was evolving into a criminal case that could result in David facing decades in federal prison. Margaret outlined the immediate implications for our civil case. Stephanie's testimony and documentation would make it virtually impossible for David to defend against fraud charges. More importantly, the criminal investigation would likely result in asset freezing that could help recover the money David had stolen. But there were also risks I needed to understand. Federal investigators would want to interview me extensively about my knowledge of David's activities. Every business decision, every client interaction, and every financial transaction would be scrutinized to determine whether I had been an unwitting victim or a knowledgeable participant. Stephanie handed me a flash drive containing copies of all the documentation she'd provided to federal investigators. Rachel, I know this doesn't undo the damage David has caused, but I hope this evidence helps you recover what he stole from you. After Stephanie left, Margaret and I spent another hour reviewing the implications of her testimony. The good news was that my legal position had strengthened dramatically. David's criminal activities were so extensive and well documented that my innocence was clear to anyone reviewing the evidence. The challenging news was that the federal investigation would likely take months or years to resolve. During that time, my reputation could be damaged by association with David's crimes, even though I was clearly a victim rather than a perpetrator. Margaret recommended that I immediately contact every client of our original partnership to clarify my role and distance myself from any activities I hadn't been aware of. We would also need to prepare a comprehensive public statement explaining my innocence and cooperation with law enforcement. The drive home from Margaret's office took me through downtown Portland as the afternoon rush hour was beginning. Office workers streamed out of glass towers, heading to happy hours and family dinners, living normal lives untouched by federal investigations and criminal partnerships. I envied their simplicity. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment's parking garage. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Miss Thompson, this is Agent Sarah Kim with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I understand you've been working with attorney Margaret Chen regarding fraudulent activities by your business partner David Martinez. The reality of speaking with a federal agent made the situation feel surreal. Yes, that's correct. My attorney advised me to cooperate fully with any investigation. Agent Kim's voice was professional, but not unkind. We'd like to schedule an interview to discuss your knowledge of Mr. Martinez's business activities. This would be a voluntary interview, and you're welcome to have your attorney present. We scheduled the interview for the following week, giving Margaret time to prepare me for the types of questions federal investigators typically asked in fraud cases. The conversation would be recorded and could potentially be used in criminal proceedings against David. That evening, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by boxes of business documents, trying to piece together the timeline of David's deception. Every client contract, every financial statement, and every business decision took on new significance when viewed through the lens of criminal investigation. I found myself questioning memories and interactions that had seemed normal at the time. David's insistence on handling certain client communications personally, his reluctance to provide detailed financial reports, his casual mentions of networking events and business meetings that I'd never been invited to attend. The pattern of manipulation had been so gradual and expertly executed that I'd never suspected the scope of his deception. He'd positioned himself as the social face of our partnership while I focused on creative work, making it easy for him to develop client relationships I knew nothing about. My phone buzzed with a text message from Linda Martinez. FBI agents came to the house today. David's been arrested. Thought you should know. The news should have brought satisfaction, but instead, I felt a hollow sadness for the waste of potential that David's choices represented. He'd been genuinely talented at client relations and business development. If he'd channeled that energy into legitimate partnerships, we could have built something substantial and ethical together. I spent the rest of the evening researching the legal process for federal fraud cases. The penalties David faced were severe, potentially including decades in prison and millions in restitution payments. The criminal charges would also make it much easier for me to recover damages in civil court. But the personal cost of his betrayal went beyond financial calculations. 3 years of my professional life had been built on a foundation of lies. Every client success, every business milestone, and every moment of pride in our partnership had been tainted by the knowledge that David was systematically stealing from both me and our clients. The next morning brought a call from Marcus Rivera at Cascade Industries. The FBI had contacted them as part of their investigation, and Marcus wanted to assure me that my independent consulting contract was unaffected by the criminal case against David. Rachel, I want you to know that Cascade's investigation confirmed what we suspected from the beginning. Your work has been consistently excellent, and our decision to continue working with you was based entirely on professional merit rather than any relationship to the criminal activities. Marcus also shared information that added another layer to David's deception. The FBI had discovered that David had been representing himself to other companies as Cascade's preferred vendor partner, using our legitimate contract as false credibility for his fraudulent schemes. It's likely that several companies hired David specifically because they believed Cascade had endorsed his services, Marcus explained. He was essentially using our corporate reputation to commit fraud against other businesses. The scope of David's criminal enterprise kept expanding with each new revelation. He hadn't just betrayed individual relationships, he'd created a web of deception that victimized multiple companies and potentially dozens of individual employees. That afternoon, I received a call from a reporter with the Portland Business Journal who had somehow learned about the FBI investigation. The conversation was brief and carefully managed, with me referring all questions to Margaret Chen's office, but it highlighted another challenge I would face. David's arrest and the federal investigation would likely become public knowledge within days. My business reputation could be damaged by association, even though I was clearly a victim rather than a perpetrator. I would need to be proactive about controlling the narrative and distinguishing my legitimate business activities from David's criminal schemes. Margaret advised me to prepare a public statement that clearly outlined my innocence and cooperation with law enforcement while emphasizing my commitment to ethical business practices. The statement would be released simultaneously to major Portland media outlets and posted on my professional website. The FBI interview took place the following Tuesday in a sterile conference room at the federal building downtown. Agent Kim was joined by Agent Martinez, a middle-aged man with the kind of patient demeanor that suggested he'd spent years listening to complicated financial crime stories. The questions were detailed and methodical, covering every aspect of my business relationship with David over the past 3 years. They wanted to understand the structure of our partnership, the division of responsibilities, and my knowledge of client relationships and financial arrangements. I answered every question honestly, providing documentation when requested and acknowledging the areas where David had kept me uninformed about business activities. The agent seemed satisfied with my responses and confirmed that I was considered a victim rather than a suspect in their investigation. Agent Kim explained that David had been charged with multiple federal crimes, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison, though actual sentences would depend on cooperation with investigators and the total amount of financial damage. The interview concluded with Agent Martinez providing me with a victim impact statement form. The document would allow me to describe the financial and professional damage David's crimes had caused, information that would be considered during sentencing if he was convicted. As I left the federal building, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The worst of the revelations were behind me, and law enforcement had confirmed my innocence in David's criminal schemes. But the process of rebuilding my professional reputation and recovering from his betrayal would take months or years to complete. The drive back to my apartment took me past the Morrison Street building, where David and I had started our partnership 3 years earlier. The windows of our former office were dark, yellow police tape still visible across the entrance where federal agents had executed their search warrant. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, looking up at the empty office that had once represented hope and professional ambition, the space that had witnessed late-night strategy sessions and celebration of client successes had become a crime scene, evidence of how thoroughly David's deception had corrupted everything we'd built together. But as I sat there, I realized that the real value of our partnership had never been contained in that office or in the formal business structures David had manipulated. The creative skills, client relationships, and professional reputation I'd developed were mine to keep, regardless of his criminal choices. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as news of David's arrest became public, and I worked to establish my independent consulting business. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, I felt like the worst was finally behind me. The truth had emerged, justice was being served, and I was free to build something new on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of Portland's newest office tower, adjusting the strap of my leather portfolio as I waited for the elevator to carry me to the 20th floor. The building still smelled of fresh paint and new carpet, a stark contrast to the cramped Morrison Street office where my business journey had begun. Thompson Digital. Consulting had grown beyond my most optimistic projections, and today marked the signing of our largest independent contract yet. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area decorated in warm woods and soft lighting, with my company name etched in elegant lettering on the wall behind the receptionist's desk. 3 full-time employees worked at clean workstations, visible through glass partitions, their screens displaying the colorful campaigns that had become our signature style. Amanda Foster, who had started as my legal advisor and evolved into something closer to a business strategist, emerged from the conference room with a smile that told me everything had gone according to plan. Rachel, the Northwest Healthcare. Group contract is signed and executed. 18 months, full creative control, and a fee structure that reflects your premium positioning in the market. The contract represented everything I'd hoped to achieve when I'd first imagined running my own agency. A sophisticated client that valued creative excellence over networking relationships, a partnership built on transparent communication and mutual respect, and financial terms that reflected the true value of strategic marketing expertise. Amanda handed me the signed documents, thick legal papers that represented security and independence rather than the vulnerability I'd felt during the David Martinez crisis. We've also received 3 more inquiries this week from companies that saw the Portland Business Journal feature about your ethical business practices. The media coverage of David's criminal case had initially felt like a professional liability, but Margaret Chen's strategic communications approach had transformed the narrative. Instead of being remembered as the victim of a business partner's fraud, I'd become known as an example of how to maintain integrity under pressure and build success through authentic client relationships. The article had detailed my cooperation with federal investigators and highlighted the distinction between legitimate business practices and the criminal schemes that had operated alongside our original partnership. More importantly, it had featured testimonials from clients who praised the quality and consistency of work I'd delivered throughout the crisis. David's sentencing had taken place 2 months earlier in federal court. 12 years in prison, 5 years of supervised release, and restitution payments totaling over $2 million to the clients he'd defrauded. The judge had specifically noted the breadth of his deception and the damage it had caused to innocent business partners and clients. I'd attended the sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because Margaret had advised that victim impact statements were more powerful when delivered in person. Sitting in the courtroom as David was led away in handcuffs had provided closure I hadn't expected to feel. Linda Martinez had also been in the courtroom that day, wearing a simple black dress that suggested mourning for the marriage that David's choices had destroyed. We'd spoken briefly in the hallway afterward, 2 women who had been manipulated by the same man, but had chosen different paths forward. She'd finalized their divorce proceedings and used her share of the restitution payments to start fresh in Seattle, taking a marketing position with a nonprofit organization focused on supporting women entrepreneurs. Her experience with David's deception had motivated her to help other women recognize and escape manipulative business relationships. Stephanie Blackwood had also rebuilt her career after cooperating with federal investigators. Her testimony had been crucial in securing David's conviction, and her willingness to expose his crimes had earned respect from law enforcement and business leaders who understood the courage required to testify against someone who had manipulated her trust. She'd moved to San Francisco and joined a consulting firm that specialized in corporate ethics and vendor relationship management. Her experience with David's fraud had given her unique insights into the warning signs of unethical business practices, expertise that was increasingly valuable in an era of complex corporate partnerships. The afternoon brought a celebration lunch with my team at a restaurant overlooking the Willamette River. The conversation flowed easily between current projects and future possibilities, the kind of professional enthusiasm that only exists when everyone feels valued and respected. Tyler Chen, my lead graphic designer, raised his glass of local wine in a toast to Thompson Digital Consulting and to proving that good work speaks louder than dirty tricks. Nicole Rivera, who managed client relationships with the kind of authentic enthusiasm that built lasting partnerships, added her own perspective, and to showing that you can build something substantial without compromising your values or stepping on other people. The toast felt like validation of everything I'd learned during the crisis with David. Success built on deception was ultimately fragile and unsustainable, but success built on competence, integrity, and genuine client service created a foundation that could weather any storm. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself reflecting on the personal transformation that had occurred alongside my professional growth. The woman who had sat in that restaurant 6 months ago, confused and betrayed by a business partner's lies, had evolved into someone who trusted her own judgment and wasn't afraid to stand up for her principles. The experience with David had taught me to recognize manipulation tactics and trust my instincts when something felt wrong in a business relationship. More importantly, it had shown me that survival often required the courage to walk away from situations that seemed comfortable but were ultimately toxic. My phone buzzed with a text message from Kevin Walsh, who had remained a trusted friend and occasional collaborator throughout the entire ordeal. His construction management firm had just landed a major development project, and he wanted Thompson Digital to handle the marketing campaign. Kevin's loyalty during the David Martinez crisis had deepened our professional relationship into something more meaningful than simple networking. He'd been one of the first people to publicly vouch for my integrity when rumors about the federal investigation had threatened to damage my reputation. The message was typical Kevin, direct and enthusiastic. New project, bigger budget, and I want the best marketing firm in Portland. When can we meet? I responded immediately, suggesting a meeting the following week. Kevin's projects were always interesting, involving the kind of community-focused development that aligned with my personal values and provided opportunities for creative campaign strategies. The drive back to my apartment took me through familiar Portland neighborhoods, past coffee shops and bookstores that had become regular meeting spots for client conversations. The city felt different now, more like home and less like a place where I was trying to establish myself professionally. That evening, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a significant milestone and sat on my apartment's small balcony overlooking the tree-lined street below. The summer evening was warm and clear, with the kind of golden light that made Portland feel magical, despite its reputation for rain. A letter had arrived that afternoon from the Federal Victim Restitution Program, informing me that my financial recovery claim had been approved in full. The check wouldn't arrive for several more months, but knowing that David's stolen money would eventually be returned provided a sense of justice that went beyond the financial implications. More importantly, the letter confirmed that my cooperation with investigators had been valuable in helping other victims recover their losses. Several of the companies David had defrauded were small businesses whose survival had depended on the marketing services they'd thought they were purchasing. My testimony had helped ensure they received compensation for the substandard work they'd received. As I sipped my wine and watched the neighborhood transition from day to evening, I thought about the woman I'd been when this story began. Someone who had trusted too easily, who had allowed a manipulative partner to handle important business relationships, and who had been willing to accept being marginalized in her own company. The crisis had forced me to develop skills I'd never needed before: legal strategy, media relations, federal investigation procedures, and the complex process of rebuilding professional relationships that had been damaged by association with criminal activity. But the most valuable lesson had been learning to trust my own capabilities and judgment. David's betrayal had initially felt like evidence that I was naive about business relationships. Instead, it had revealed that my instincts about ethical practices and authentic client service were exactly the foundation needed for sustainable success. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. The caller ID showed Margaret Chen's number, which usually meant either very good news or potential complications that required immediate attention. Rachel, Margaret's voice carried excitement rather than concern. I just received a call from the Oregon State Bar Association. They want to invite you to speak at their annual conference about business ethics and partnership fraud prevention. The invitation represented recognition that went beyond simple professional success. Legal professionals wanted to learn from my experience because it illustrated both the warning signs of partnership fraud and the strategies for recovery that had proven effective. More speaking opportunities would likely follow, potentially evolving into a consulting specialty that could complement my marketing business. Companies increasingly recognize the value of ethical business practices, not just for legal compliance, but for building sustainable competitive advantages. Margaret continued with additional news that felt like vindication. The FBI investigation has also identified 3 other women in different cities who were victims of similar schemes by other perpetrators. Your willingness to testify and share. Your story has helped law enforcement recognize patterns that led to additional arrests. The revelation that my experience had contributed to protecting other potential victims provided a sense of purpose that went beyond personal recovery. David's betrayal had been devastating, but sharing the lessons learned from that experience could prevent other women from suffering similar manipulation. As the evening progressed, I found myself thinking about the future with excitement rather than anxiety. Thompson Digital Consulting had established itself as a respected agency that attracted clients who valued integrity and creative excellence. The speaking opportunities would provide additional revenue streams and position me as an expert in business ethics and fraud prevention. But the personal transformation felt even more significant than professional achievements. The woman who had once accepted being listed as a +1 at her business partner's events now commanded respect in boardrooms and courtrooms. The crisis that had initially felt like professional destruction had become the catalyst for building something stronger and more authentic. I raised my wine glass in a solitary toast to the Portland skyline visible in the distance, to survival, growth, and the courage to build something better from the wreckage of betrayal. The months ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities, but I faced them with confidence earned through surviving the worst kind of professional betrayal and emerging stronger on the other side. David Martinez had taught me that trust must be earned and verified, but he'd also shown me that integrity and competence were more powerful than manipulation and deception. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt grateful for the crisis that had initially seemed like disaster. Without David's betrayal, I might have remained forever in partnerships that limited my potential and compromised my values. His crimes had forced me to discover capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenient networking. The woman who fell asleep that night was someone who trusted her own judgment, demanded ethical treatment from business partners, and had built success on a foundation that no one could steal or manipulate. The worst betrayal of my professional life had become the beginning of my best chapter. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.